in the heart of Zimbabwe, where dusty roads weave through golden plains and copper sunsets, something extraordinary began, an invention that could challenge the very foundations of the global auto industry. Maxwell Chikumbusto, an engineer whose name once barely echoed beyond Harare, unveiled a machine that whispered the future, a self-powered electric vehicle. No cables, no plugs, no petrol, just possibility. It didn't start with a media frenzy. There were no flashing lights or major corporate sponsors. There was simply an idea, forged in a modest workshop. Then EV could generate its own power, a vehicle that defied the global dependency on charging stations and fossil fuels. Most dismissed it as fantasy, but Chikumbusto believed. He built, and then he drove 7,500 kilometers from Zimbabwe to Cairo. One man, one machine, and no stops to charge. Word spread slowly at first. A few locals recorded videos. Independent bloggers raised eyebrows. But when the vehicle crossed into Zambia, still moving, still silent, still self-powered, whispers turned into headlines. What kind of energy system powered this EV? Chikumbusto called it the greener power machine, a closed-loop energy system that regenerated as it moved. The scientific community scoffed. Perpetual motion, they said. Impossible. Yet the car rolled on, past skeptics, through deserts, around mountains, along the arteries of Africa's vast geography. In Tanzania, children chased the EV with laughter. In Kenya, mechanics tried to study it, but couldn't find a conventional engine under the hood. The vehicle didn't overheat. It didn't stall. It didn't ask for anything. Just more road. By the time it reached Ethiopia, footage had gone viral. Global news outlets started to pay attention. Not with praise, but suspicion. Why haven't we heard of this? Where's the patent? Is this safe? These are the questions being asked. But Chikumbusto wasn't interested in interviews or investors. He was on a mission to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Africa could lead a technological revolution, not follow one. As he approached Sudan, military checkpoints waved him through. Some out of curiosity, others out of admiration. Engineers began flying in, hoping to catch a glimpse, to measure voltage, to inspect the anomaly. None could explain what they saw. Some called it a hoax. Others believed they were witnessing the future. Meanwhile, oil giants began to sweat. Social media was on fire. Hashtags like hashtag Africa Drives Future and hashtag Chikumbusto Revolution trended globally. In Europe and America, debates erupted. Was this the end of EV dependency? Could one man in Zimbabwe really have solved the charging problem Tesla, and others had spent billions trying to crack? Still, Chikumbusto said nothing. He simply drove, approaching the Egyptian border. The vehicle had now traveled over 7,300 kilometers. Still no fuel, no solar panels, no external power source. Cairo was in sight, and so was a new chapter for Africa. But as he crossed into Egypt, something unexpected happened. A convoy appeared. Egyptian authorities, joined by international observers, greeted him not with celebration, but with caution. Scientists, media crews, and even diplomats wanted answers. Who built this? How does it work? Is it safe? Is it even legal? Maxwell stepped out, calm and composed, dressed in his usual denim shirt and worn cap. He looked more like a mechanic than a revolutionary, but he carried with him a quiet defiance. He opened the hood. What they saw stunned them. Not wires, not batteries, but a compact, humming core. A black box pulsing with energy, something none of the observers could identify. Some said it looked like a miniature fusion cell. Others thought it was magnetic propulsion. One engineer whispered, "If this is real, it changes everything." Maxwell didn't offer schematics. He didn't unlock the code. Not yet. He simply smiled and said, "Africa has always been more than a story of poverty and aid. It's a continent of invention, and this is only the beginning." As night fell over Cairo and camera flashes lit up the skyline, the world finally realized this wasn't just about a car. It was about rewriting the rules, not just of transport, but of power, of who gets to lead and who gets left behind. But the journey wasn't over. Because somewhere deep in a lab in Harare, another prototype was already being tested. And this time, it wasn't a car. It was something else. And the world wasn't ready. To be continued. You said, continue from where you stop, and please don't end. ChatGPT said, this new machine, still veiled beneath tarps and silence, pulsed with the same quiet confidence that had carried the EV across the length of Africa. Those who had caught a glimpse of it described it only in fragments. It floats, one whispered. It's not touching the ground. Another said, it doesn't hum like the EV. It's silent, too silent. Rumors began to circle online. Was Maxwell building a self-powered drone? A transport pod? A generator that could power an entire village? No one knew. What was clear, though, was that this was not a one-time miracle. This was a movement, and it was growing. Back in Cairo, the EV was now parked at a secure research facility, guarded not just by local police, but by international interests. Offers began flooding in. Corporations wanted to buy the technology outright. One U.S. energy firm offered $100 million for exclusive rights. A Chinese conglomerate proposed full-scale production in exchange for lifetime royalties. But Maxwell declined them all. This technology belongs to Africa, he said in a rare press briefing. It was born here. It must serve here first. That statement alone sent shockwaves through the halls of power. For decades, Africa had been the marketplace, not the inventor, the supplier of raw materials, not the designer of futures. Now, one man was flipping the script, and the world didn't know how to respond. Meanwhile, across the continent, young inventors, entrepreneurs, and dreamers began to rise. In Nigeria, a group of engineering students started designing their own self-power systems inspired by Chikumbusto's designs. In Ghana, a university offered a full course titled Post-Fossil Engineering, the Chikumbusto paradigm. Even in South Africa, where skepticism had initially been high, the National Science Council formed a new task force to investigate clean, self-sustaining technologies. But not everyone was inspired. In boardrooms from London to Riyadh, powerful men stared at plummeting investment charts. Oil futures dipped. EV charging networks saw halted contracts. Energy ministers called emergency meetings. How do you compete with a vehicle that doesn't need fuel or a grid? Pressure mounted. Maxwell's phone buzzed day and night. He changed numbers, disconnected, operated in silence. Still, the Harare lab glowed at night. Its windows covered, its grounds patrolled, but its atmosphere alive with experimentation. A small team, loyal and hand-picked, worked alongside him. Engineers, physicists, even a few teenage prodigies who had shown promise online and were quietly flown in. They worked on something called Project Nyamatsads. Shona for star. The name wasn't just poetic. It was literal. The machine being built wasn't designed for road or rail. It was meant for the sky. Whispers inside the lab spoke of anti-gravity, of a propulsion system that did not rely on combustion or rotors or wings. Something new, something unseen. And while this unfolded in quiet secrecy, something else began to rise. Opposition. International pressure mounted. Articles appeared branding Maxwell fraud, his journey a hoax, his inventions impossible under the known laws of physics. One editorial in a major Western paper declared, Africa's EV messiah is a myth, but facts are stubborn. And so is footage. Thousands of kilometers, dozens of borders, eyewitness accounts, energy readings. No one could find the plug. No one could debunk the journey. Then one night, without announcement or media, the prototype from Project Nyamatsads lifted 2 meters off the lab floor. No wind, no noise, just elevation. And for the first time, Maxwell looked at his team and said, now they'll come. He was right. The next day, satellite images showed unusual drone activity above Zimbabwe. Unmarked aircraft entered nearby airspace. Telecommunications in the area experienced strange disruptions. Foreign agents disguised as journalists began appearing in Harare. The message was clear. Someone out there wanted this technology at any cost. But Maxwell had prepared. What no one outside the lab knew was that plans for Project Naimatsats had already been replicated and encrypted on dozens of offline hard drives, distributed quietly across Africa, hidden in libraries, tucked into schools, delivered to trusted hands in Kenya, Uganda, Botswana, Rwanda. The revolution would not be stopped by one man's disappearance, because now the idea had wings, and soon it would fly. The first public flight wasn't supposed to happen for months. Maxwell had insisted on more tests, more data, more redundancy. But after the swarm of surveillance and near incursions, the timeline collapsed. His team agreed. They had to show the world before someone tried to silence the future. It was dusk over Lake Kariba, the sky painted in purples and fire orange. A location chosen deliberately, remote yet symbolic. Here, where generations had once relied on hydroelectric power, a new kind of energy was about to rise, weightless and unbound, with no runway, no control tower, and no audience but the few dozen loyal engineers who had built it. The aircraft levitated gently from the red earth. It didn't roar or sputter. It glided upward with the grace of a leaf on still air, impossibly stable, eerily quiet. It hovered at 20 meters for nearly 10 minutes, before returning to ground with absolute precision. It had no rotors, no exhaust, no external propellers. And yet it flew. Maxwell stood there, not as a triumphant inventor, but as a man watching the inevitable unfold. He looked up at the stars, then at the aircraft, and said, "Let them try to deny this." Within hours, footage was online, not through mainstream networks, but through decentralized African tech channels. Independent creators uploaded 4K drone shots. A teenage coder in Nairobi live-streamed a breakdown of the aircraft's stabilized flight pattern. Ghanaian vloggers translated the video into 5 local languages. Hashtags ignited. Hashtag Africa Flies First. Hashtag Maxwell Rising. Hashtag Sky Revolution. The internet caught fire, but so did interest from intelligence agencies. Just 48 hours later, 2 men in dark suits arrived in Lusaka. Their identities were unclear, their mission even less so. They asked questions about the Harare team, about flight paths, about Project Naimatsats. Locals said they spoke in careful, clipped tones. They left as quietly as they came, but they weren't alone. Satellite scans detected heavy data spikes around Zimbabwe's borders. Cyber attacks began targeting servers across southern Africa, many of them universities, innovation hubs, and government portals connected to Chikumbusto's past. But the data was secure. Maxwell's foresight had seen this coming. No files were stored online. Nothing lived in the cloud. The blueprints, like the belief that built them, were embedded in people, in minds, not machines. Still, the pressure mounted. Leaked memos revealed that multiple world powers had labeled Chikumbusto's work as a disruptive geopolitical threat. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was independent. If Africa could build its own transport, generate its own power, fly its own craft, what would happen to the world order? What would happen to aid? To investment? To control? But it was too late. In Burkina Faso, students replicated a smaller version of the propulsion core. In Malawi, an off-grid village began testing self-powered energy hubs based on simplified EV schematics. In Morocco, engineers proposed a railway alternative using hover tech inspired by leaked images from Naimatsats. The revolution was now cellular, no longer centralized, no longer containable. And just when the world began scrambling to catch up, something else happened. A second aircraft launched, not from Zimbabwe, but from Namibia. This one was sleeker, faster, piloted remotely. It traveled 1,000 kilometers across open desert and returned with 80% of its stored self-generated power. And it wasn't built by Chikumbusto. It was built by a 22-year-old woman who had studied his footage, cracked part of the resonance algorithm, and rebuilt the tech with improvements. She called it Saudi, the voice. Maxwell heard her flight days later. He smiled quietly. "They're not just building what I started," he said to his team. "They're improving it." And that's when he knew this wasn't about him anymore. It never really was. The power had shifted, not to a man, not to a government, but to a people who had always been told to wait for permission, for funding, for validation from the West. Now they were taking it, creating it, flying it, and far above them all, a silent, self-powered craft crossed the African night sky, untethered by wires, politics, or doubt, carving a new constellation in the dark. As Saudi glided above the Sahel, visible only to those who looked closely at the stars that didn't blink, a network of minds had already begun collaborating in secret, coders, designers, and garage engineers from Cape Town to Kigali. They weren't waiting for recognition. They were rewriting the rules in real time. Maxwell's quiet revolution had become a decentralized awakening. And then came the announcement that shifted everything again. In a live-stream broadcast from Accra, Ghana, a feed free from corporate sponsorship or government seal, a coalition of young African technologists introduced Project Umoja. Not a company, not a startup, a movement. Their mission: to unify self-powered tech breakthroughs under one open-source platform shareable by all, owned by none. They showed flight telemetry from community-built crafts, electric grid diagrams powered entirely by self-looping generators, city transportation models with no fuel inputs. And at the heart of it all, they unveiled the Umoja Protocol, a digital library encoded with the foundational principles Maxwell had seeded: secure, peer-reviewed, adaptable for local contexts. The response was immediate. Servers struggled under the weight of downloads from Brazil, India, Indonesia. Translation projects launched overnight. Hackers tried and failed to breach the system's encryption. But this time, it wasn't just Africa watching. In Detroit, a major EV manufacturer suspended production for restructuring. In Berlin, protesters demanded their government investigate why such innovation had emerged without a single Western patent. In Tokyo, a conglomerate offered to fund an African-based R&D center, but insisted on exclusive innovation rights. The offer was rejected within hours. Back in Harare, Maxwell remained focused. The original aircraft had now undergone a dozen iterations. He no longer worked alone. His lab had become a school, fluid, informal, alive. Teenagers debated torque coefficients. Elders discussed supply chains. Builders came and went, leaving pieces of their ideas behind like brushstrokes on a mural no one could sign. But they all asked the same question: what comes next? Maxwell answered with a new directive: Project Veen, the Shona word for sacred. This wasn't about transport anymore. This was about power, literal power. Zveen aimed to build a city that powered itself entirely. No grid, no diesel, no solar farms. Just a web of self-sustaining systems. Homes, vehicles, public spaces, all drawing energy from decentralized nodes derived from the same self-power core used in his EV. It would start small, 20 homes in a rural region outside Cairo, each one constructed with local materials, engineered with passive cooling, fitted with a black box energy unit smaller than a microwave. No wires would enter or exit the area. No bills. No outages. Critics called it dangerous. Financial analysts called it a threat to global utility markets. But the people who moved into those homes didn't care. They had lights, water pumps, cooking stoves, all running on invisible, silent energy. And for the first time in generations, they weren't dependent on anyone for power. Not a company, not a government, not a foreign loan. They had autonomy. Meanwhile, an anonymous document circulated online, an internal memo from a major energy conglomerate. The subject line read, Containment Strategy, Chikumbusto Network. The bullet points included plans to discredit, co-opt, or infiltrate the growing open-source movement. But before the memo could be acted upon, it was leaked, and the global backlash was immediate. Support poured in from unexpected places. Indigenous groups in the Amazon who had long resisted deforestation saw parallels. Activists in the Philippines called the technology digital sovereignty. Even a senator in the U.S. praised the movement, saying, "This is what climate justice looks like, from the ground up." And then, once again, something shifted. Maxwell disappeared. No press release. No goodbye. His lab continued. The projects advanced. But the man himself was gone. Some said he went into hiding, fearing assassination. Others believed he was taken. By who, no one could say. But many believed something else, that he had simply stepped aside, letting the revolution outgrow the myth of one man. And indeed it did. In Senegal, a team created a self-powered fishing fleet. In Ethiopia, school children assembled mini propulsion kits in science class. In Lesotho, a mountaintop weather station ran for months on a single unit. And across the world, people stopped asking if it was possible. They started asking how to build it. Maxwell had once said, "This isn't technology, this is liberation." And now, that liberation moved faster than borders, deeper than patents, louder than silence. Somewhere, perhaps walking through a village with no name, or riding in a craft the world has never seen, the man who sparked it all watches quietly, not with pride, but with certainty, because what he started was no longer a project, no longer a prototype. It was a pulse, and now it was alive. That pulse began to beat in rhythm with the heartbeat of a continent long underestimated, long mined for its resources, but never its genius. Now, in corners of Africa where infrastructure had once failed to reach, humming energy cores power classrooms where children read by clean, steady light. Clinics once shackled by diesel costs now ran uninterrupted refrigeration for vaccines. Farmers irrigated fields through self-powered pump systems linked to weather sensors developed by kids no older than 15. It wasn't just innovation, it was restoration. In Nairobi, a young technologist named Amina built what she called a mobility hive, a network of modular EVs that communicated and powered each other wirelessly as they moved through the city. Her algorithm learned terrain, population density, and traffic patterns to distribute energy dynamically. She didn't patent it. She published it to Umoja Protocol with one note. For anyone who ever walked 10 kilometers to school, in Dakar, the coastal winds no longer powered spinning turbines. They powered nothing at all. A lighthouse on Gorée Island ran for a year with a single self-power core. Visitors from France, stunned by the silence and consistency, asked to license the system. The locals declined. "This is not for sale," the lighthouse keeper said. "This is a gift reclaimed." The global energy market scrambled. Stocks in fossil and transitional fuels became volatile. Greenwashing campaigns collapsed under scrutiny. For the first time, climate summits began inviting voices not from think tanks, but from Tembisa, Lusaka, to Mali, places where the technology was being used, lived, shared. And the question changed from "can this scale?" to "why did no one believe it could?" In Johannesburg, a documentary aired in hushed tones, the Chikumbusto silence. It chronicled the years Maxwell spent being ignored, suppressed, mocked. Viewers wept as they watched grainy footage of his first EV prototype struggling over potholes, a younger Maxwell welding by hand, while children clapped from a distance. By the time the credits rolled, social media lit up with a new mantra: "We believe now." And yet, still no word from the man himself. His lab, now run by his former team, was more vibrant than ever. The core group, technologists, dreamers, builders, had begun training satellite labs across the continent. No two labs looked the same. In Tunisia, it resembled a desert tent cooled by smart fabric. In Rwanda, it lived inside a repurposed shipping container. In Sierra Leone, it was built from bamboo, solar glass, and clay. They didn't wait for funding. They didn't ask for validation. They built. Meanwhile, governments began shifting, not out of idealism, but necessity. Why invest billions in imported fossil infrastructure when villages were generating their own power for free? Why sign long-term loans for gas pipelines when hover transit systems were being assembled from open-source blueprints? One nation, Zambia, made the boldest move yet. It passed the Open Energy Sovereignty Act, legally protecting community-developed self-powered systems from foreign acquisition. The bill's introduction caused panic in overseas capitals, but inspired swift copycats in Mozambique, Togo, and later Indonesia and Bolivia. This wasn't just an African wave. It had become a global tectonic shift. And still no Maxwell. But sometimes people swore they saw him. A man with a beard and a cap buying sugarcane from a roadside vendor near Maputo. A quiet stranger helping students adjust propulsion nodes in Madagascar. A figure seen briefly on a boat in Lake Victoria, carrying a notebook and smiling at the moon. Whether it was him or not didn't matter anymore, because now, even without him, the movement lived. It had branched into medicine, into clean water systems, into disaster recovery shelters that powered themselves upon unfolding. It had sparked a new cultural renaissance. Songs, films, books all celebrating Guvyumuno, the power within us. At the Umoja Annual Summit in Kigali, 2027, a young girl, 10 years old, barefoot, and brilliant, stood before the audience. She had created a wearable energy harvester that powered school tablets through motion. Her speech lasted only one sentence. If we keep building what they said we couldn't, maybe they'll finally see who we are. Thunderous applause. Not just for her, but for every kid soldering wires in a tin roof house, every elder handing down wisdom in rural dialects, every person who had ever dared to believe that Africa wasn't behind. It was just starting. And somewhere, far from cameras and microphones, perhaps beneath a baobab tree or seated by candlelight, Maxwell Chikumbusto hears the hum of a new vehicle rolling by. One he didn't build, but inspired. He smiles. The pulse continues. Years passed. The world changed in ways no analyst could have predicted. What began as one man's quiet defiance had restructured economies, rewritten education systems, and redrawn the map of innovation itself. By 2030, over 40 countries across Africa had adopted self-powered infrastructures at scale. There were no longer developing nations, only emerging leaders in the era of energy sovereignty. Cities that once went dark at sundown now glowed with soft, reliable light. The air was cleaner, the skies clearer, the roads quieter but alive. International institutions scrambled to keep up. Universities in the West rewrote their curricula, now teaching Chikumbusto mechanics and Umoja theory alongside Einstein and Tesla. Global news outlets, once skeptical, now hail the African model as humanity's best hope against climate collapse. And then came the letter, delivered by hand, with no return address, to the Umoja Summit in Lagos. It was addressed simply to the builders. Inside, a short note in Maxwell's handwriting. It was never about being seen. It was about what we could see when we finally believed in ourselves. You saw it. You built it. Keep going. The room went silent, not from shock, but reverence. He had said goodbye without needing to appear. His final words weren't a farewell. They were a handoff. And so, Africa didn't pause to celebrate a man. It moved forward with the momentum he sparked. Children born after the first EV journey now read about it in storybooks and history lessons. They learn not just about circuits and engines, but about courage, integrity, and the radical act of building without waiting for permission. In villages and cities alike, people no longer feared the dark. They had learned to make their own light. And somewhere, perhaps deep in the mountains or sailing silently above a cloud line in a vessel he never named, Maxwell watched his continent fly. He did not need credit. He had lit the fuse. Africa had ignited the stars.